Okay, thank you for joining us. Tonight's shir on Parashat Beha'alotcha is sponsored by Susan Kahn. It's to commemorate the fourth yortzeit of her beloved son Tzvi Dov Shmuel ben Yaakov, Zichrono Livracha, and Bat Sheva Necha. The yortzeit is on the 18th of Sivan tonight. So thank you, Susan, for the sponsorship. The neshama of Tzvi should have an aliyah. Remember Tzvi, and obviously a moment to remember, reflect, and he should benefit from all the good deeds and the words of Torah that we're going to study here tonight in his memory. So welcome. We have a loaded parsha to study, and there are actually two things I would like to discuss tonight, two main things, and they have some significant details that fill the picture. I go back to when I was a young yeshiva boy at age 13, and if there's a message I could give to the young me among the many, one of them would be to place the rabbis you are studying in their proper historical time. In other words, the young boy could be studying the words of a Talmudic authority like Abaye or Rava, and then suddenly move over to a discussion where the Ramban Nachmanides share something, and then have an analysis that was presented by an 18th century rabbi or a 19th century rabbi, like the Chassam Sofer, the Noda Yehuda, or the Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And I do remember that everything was this, I would call it a salad. In other words, there was not clarity. Things were not placed. Things were far from being organized. And when they're not organized, you cannot really understand the progress or even the concept themselves clearly, because you have not placed them historically. It's very important that when you study things, when you study any text, you know who wrote it, when they lived. And obviously, and this is something that's very traditional, that if they are earlier authorities, they're Rishonim, we take their opinion into great consideration. If it's a later authority, we're going to obviously always be respectful, but we can seek other ways to understand what they argue or present. It's important to understand the chronology and appreciate it. Now, when it comes to the text of Torah itself, there's a very well-known rule. En mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. When it comes to Torah, it's not a book of history. Things are not going to be presented in a chronological order. Now, there are those who argue, like Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, a 13th century authority, that unless told otherwise, a person should assume that if a story is shared in the Torah, it occurred after the story that was mentioned earlier, as a general rule. But at the same time, there's no disagreement that there are times in the Torah where things are simply out of order. En mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. It's not a book that's presenting to the reader history. It's not a book of history. It's a book of guidance. It's how to live, how to look at life, and how to maximize existence, how to do good, how to be an ethical person, how to be an appreciative person. It's Torah. It's not historia. It's not history. Now, the one place in the Torah where it is clear cut and there's no way to argue in any other way that things are not presented in a chronological order, appears in Parashat Beha'alotcha, where we read in the beginning of the 9th chapter, it's Shlishi this week, where Hashem speaks to Moshe Bashana Hashanit. It's the second year after the departure from Eretz Mitzrayim. B'chodesh Harishon, it's the first month. Le'emor ve'ya'asu bnei Yisrael et ha'Pasach. They should go ahead, and the children of Israel should bring the Pesach offering. So this appears in Parashat Beha'alotcha, the third parsha Bamidbar, and it mentions that HaKadosh Baruch Hu communicates with Moshe in the first month of the second year. But if you turn back to the beginning of Bamidbar, the beginning of Parashat Bamidbar, in the first verse, HaKadosh Baruch Hu communicates with Moshe Be'echad lachodesh hasheni b'shana hashanit. A month later, events that take place a month after that, which is described in Parashat Beha'alotcha, at least some details, are mentioned 2 parshiyot ago. What happened to the order? En mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. Things are not in order. Okay, we accept it. Now, the obvious question is, why? Right? Well, there must be a reason for it. In other words, what if the author here decides that he's going to present things out of order, he must have a good reason for it. And if the author of this text has a reason for something, we have a mitzvah to try to understand it and learn a lesson from it. So what I would like to study with you tonight is an approach that's presented by Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, a great commentator, early 16th century. And he loves sharing with us insight that earlier authorities do not share and they did not come up with. But what's beautiful is that all his insights are based on Torah values. And he wants us to learn something. And he wants us to understand that sometimes you could read into Torah things that perhaps earlier commentators did not say, but if they are based on Torah values, that's a kosher explanation, even if it's original. So comes this Sforno, and he tells us that you should know things are out of order here because the history of our ancestors in the wilderness had one track, the track of reality, but then there was an alternative track, which would have been the ideal track. In other words, we know the story that our ancestors spent 40 years in the wilderness. We know that things went wrong. The sin, first the golden calf, and obviously the sin of the spies that we're going to study next week. Things went wrong. And therefore we took this long track. But here and there, the Torah does hint that if things would have gone right, they could have entered Eretz Israel immediately. And the history of Israel and the history of humanity would have been a very different history. Now, due to the fact that there were 2 tracks, what is taking place here, in other words, the information that's provided here, that starts off by describing events that occurred prior to the events described earlier, are the events that he calls Arba'at Ma'asim, that the Torah lists for us 4 good deeds, She'asu Israel, 4 good things that our ancestors did right, that with them, Shebahem Zachu Likanes La'aretz Miyad Bilti Milchama. In other words, there could have been a reality of our ancestors entering Eretz Israel immediately. And this wouldn't have been just an average entry, but an entry that the nations in that land would have recognized our rights, right? That's that's what we believe fundamentally, that when the right time comes, humanity will recognize our role. When people ask questions about the Temple Mount, right? And what do we do? Right now, there's a structure that does not belong there. What we could say is that we will never remove that structure on the Temple Mount unless those who are there hand it over to us. And our faith tells us that will occur because humanity will recognize the unique role we, the people of Israel, have, the unique role that we have in the land of Israel. And yes, Yerushalayim is our hub. That's what our faith teaches us. Our ancestors in the wilderness were on the path to enter Eretz Yisrael bilti milchama, without war. They would have entered the land of Israel, and there would have been full recognition to our right and our connection. You don't merit that for nothing, but rather, writes this Sforno, 4 good deeds are mentioned here. There are 4 good deeds that in their merit, we would have made our way into the land in peace. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the Sforno presents to us. And again, he's trying to explain, why are things out of order? Well, it could be in some ways our history was out of order, meaning there was the track of reality, which the Parsha started, which the Chumash of Bamidbar started off with. And then it moved on to the track, what could have been, but we could learn. We could learn from what we did and what we could have merited, if not for sin. And to add to it, since these are 4 good deeds that provided Klal Yisrael the ability to enter Eretz Yisrael and establish their presence there in peace, we must believe that since one day we're going to merit such an entry, we most probably need to understand and study and emulate these good deeds, because it's our path to redemption. So Sforno is going to present to us 4 actions that our ancestors performed. If not for sin would have led them into Eretz Yisrael, we must perform them. So what are they? They're obviously very important. So the Sforno says number 1, and we're going to break them down one at a time. Number 1, Sipur Chanukat HaMizbeach, the inauguration of the tabernacle. In other words, the story of the inauguration of the tabernacle, right, is a story that is a good deed of our ancestors. With it, we could have merited an entry into Eretz Yisrael. Number 2, their commitment to have the Levi'im take over the role of the firstborn. In other words, you know that if not for the sin of the golden calf, we wouldn't need a tribe to represent us, a tribe to lead us spiritually, but rather the leader would have been within every household. Due to the sin, we handed it over to the Levi'im, and the nation participated in this transfer of spiritual power. Good deed. In the merit of that deed, we could have had an immediate entry into Eretz Yisrael, and one day we will. That's number 2. Number 3, the commitment to perform Korban Pesach, and that's what's described here, Korban Pesach. Number 4, the willingness to follow the Creator in the Midbar, in the wilderness, even though there was no permanence. They had to settle sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for a few days. They were in the hand of God, not in their own hands when it comes to their travel itinerary. Okay, those are the 4 things which we have to analyze. And again, they are relevant for us because we could learn from them. Number 1, Sforno's number 1 on the list of a good deed. Shebahem zachu likanes la'aretz miyad. Number 1, building a spiritual center. You know that organizations that bring us together to connect us to our essence and to our Creator are important organizations. And there's an understanding that a Jew needs to be linked to a community. It's important. You need that hub. When we are on our own, our values are not the values that come forth from that spiritual hub. It's important to have that spiritual place. And ideally, it should be a Bet HaMikdash, but there's a reason we call our shul a Mikdash Me'at. It's a little bit of a Bet HaMikdash. We come there to have a conversation with our Creator. Tefillah in Tzibur is far more valuable than our tefillah alone. When it comes to the service in the Bet HaMikdash, there was a daily offering called the Tamid that was extremely valuable, and the nation understood that as long as that we are bringing the Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice, the nation is protected. In our sources, we find that service in a shul is compared to the daily service. And those who come and those who participate and those who value it are doing a very important mitzvah. And we have to have a Parashat Beha'alotcha to those who play a role. Even those who don't come benefit from the fact that there are services, that there's a conversation with the Creator of 10 people. Shuls are important to such an extent that we are told that the inauguration of the tabernacle, which turned into a temple, a Bet HaMikdash, which we still have residual spirituality from it in our shuls, was something that by the nation of Israel doing, they could have merited in entry into Eretz Yisrael. And there's no question that if we wouldn't have shuls, we could not look forward to the bright future that our tradition promises us. We need these shuls, right? It was tragic when during COVID, we couldn't have those shuls, right? And when we had the opportunity, right, it was a good thing. And I have a tremendous amount of akara satov to those who understood the value of a shul, right? And did make it difficult to return because understood that this is important. And we did it, and Baruch Hashem, right? Every time we walk in, we should, those who do, should be appreciative to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we have access to this place that brings us together. And it was sad when it was closed. And this, we are being told by the Sforno, that is number one on the list of those deeds that we need to keep ourselves as a nation. If we vanish, chas v'shalom, how can you merit a geula? How can you merit a redemption? We need such structures. That's number one, building the spiritual center. That's number one on the list to merit redemption. You know what number two on the list is? In the words of the Sforno, zrizutam, their commitment and enthusiasm when it comes to the training or inaugurating the Levi'im. We're in a generation that we have access to answers immediately. Right? You could find out anything. You could be sitting in a classroom and you wonder about a specific species of cats. If they exist in Lower Asia, within seconds, a student could find it out. We have access to everything. And the question is, why do I need really a spiritual guide? Why do I need a rabbi if Google could paskin on everything? You can find an answer to almost every question on Google. What do I need it? I have books. I have computers. What do I need that spiritual guide? And imagine our ancestors who for some period of time had the spiritual guide within their homes, the firstborn. And then suddenly it was announced that unfortunately, not due to COVID, but due to the sin of the golden calf, we need to take that right away from you and hand it over to the Levi'im. There could have been a rebellion. Klal Yisrael could have said, absolutely not. Let the Bchorot, let the firstborn be the ones to guide. Why should we hand it over to another tribe? They didn't say that. They understood. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that from now on, they are the ones to guide and inspire and to teach and to connect us. We're going to accept it. Accepting the fact and understanding we need Levi'im, we need them. And when communities support institutions of people who commit themselves to Torah, it's a good thing. It's a merit, right? When shuls have someone committed to the study of Torah and to guide in Torah. It's a merit. There's no question about it. And it's a merit. It's number 2 on the list for this Sforno of something that could have brought them into the land of Israel in a magnificent supernatural way. And one day will get us back. We need the shuls and we need those guides. We need the Levi'im. We need the people who commit themselves to Limud Torah, to Talmud Torah. We need it. That's number 2 on the list. What's number 3 on the list for this Sforno? So he points out, this Sforno here says something quite incredible. The number 3 on the list was the commitment of our ancestors. In year 2, now remember, in the beginning of year 2, they were in the process of celebrating the inauguration of the Mishkan. Okay, so year 1, they left Egypt. Come next Nisan, it's year 2. And they are in the process of celebrating every single day for the first 12 days of Nisan. They are bringing offerings. They are in the mode and of complete celebration. We have a home that's our hub that connects us. And according to many commentators, the nation of Israel felt a tremendous amount of guilt after the sin of the Chet HaEgel, the golden calf. And they were deeply concerned that their connection to the Creator is gone, is history. That hub showed them, you know what? God is interested in you. So the Mishkan, the construction of the Mishkan, the event of the inauguration was a wonderful time of simcha. Sometimes, notes the Sforno, when a person is extremely involved in current happiness, he is experiencing and living in the moment to the fullest extent, he could forget his roots. And this actually happened to our ancestors. You know that the Talmud tells us something quite shocking, that the year they celebrated the inauguration of the Bet HaMikdash in the days of King Solomon of Shlomo HaMelech, that year, they celebrated on Yom Kippur as well, and they did not fast. They were so involved in the celebration that for a 7-day period, right, from the 7th of Tishrei to the 14th of Tishrei, they celebrated and they didn't fast on Yom Kippur. Now they felt bad. They got atoned for the violation. But it appears that sometimes we are so involved in the moment, which is a good thing. To live in the moment is important, right? It's not a good way of living life by always thinking of the next thing we need to do, right? The person's going on vacation and they're finally at vacation. So they wake up in the morning and they're worrying about where they're going to eat lunch. And then after lunch, they worry about dinner. And all they are doing is worrying about the next activity. And then they don't realize that they're in such a magnificent, beautiful place and not appreciating it. It's important to live in the moment. It's important to appreciate the gifts of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No question. We live in the moment, but we cannot ignore our roots and history. And therefore, notes this Sforno, you have to understand that by the people of Israel celebrating Pesach on year 2, even though this was only a few short days after the celebration of something that was great for them, exciting for them, the inauguration of the Mishkan, by them celebrating Pesach, they were indicating, we remember our roots, we remember our history, we remember our traditions, and we do not allow the moment to blur the past. That is considered great, and that's considered important, and that's a necessity for the Sforno to merit an entry into Eretz Yisrael. I remember an event that occurred during the Sphira in 1980. Okay, I know exactly the year when it was. I was 10 years old, 1980. And I remember these things. The story works as follows. My family, we moved to Eretz Israel before Purim of 1980. And it was Yom HaAtzmaut a few weeks later, and there was an event. What was the event? So my parents obviously kept up with the community in Mexico. We left Mexico in 1980. Mexico, it was a diverse community, like all communities, and they kept up with a lot of different people. One of the people they kept up with was a family who had a son in the Mir Yeshiva. Moshe was in the Mir Yeshiva. He would spend time by us. So he became a Mir Bocher. Then there was another family that happened to come to Israel to celebrate a bar mitzvah of their son. So my parents were invited and I walked in as well. So it happened to be that we walked in to the simcha. It was my parents, myself, and Moshe. This Moshe was standing in the mirror, and his parents. And it was on Yom HaAtzmaut, and the music was blasting. And Moshe stops, and Moshe turns to my father, to his parents, and says, "I'm not going in, because after all, it's the Omer now, and I'm not going to listen to live music." And he left. And here I was, a 10-year-old child, and I remember being confused because I knew it was Omer. I knew we don't listen to music, but obviously, if people have music, it must be okay. But if it is okay, why is Moshe turning around? I remember being confused. Little did I know that little interaction symbolized such a big picture of what the Jewish people are about with this unique existence, unique gift of the 20th century of the state of Israel. Because the fact is, Yom HaAtzmaut is celebrated during the Omer. Traditionally, during the Omer, you don't celebrate. But at the same time, we want to be grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for giving us the Jewish state. How do we bring the two together? How do we do it? And obviously, I have respect for all communities. I have respect for the communities that celebrate fully. I have respect for the communities that say we have traditions, that historically we mourn during the Omer, and Moshe, the Talmud in the mirror, wouldn't go in. I could respect them all. What was confusing for a 10-year-old, something that I appreciate. But let me tell you what is important to be learned from that story. That even if we are grateful for the moments of, yes, we have a Jewish state. Yeah, the government is functional, but it's a country that's Baruch Hashem doing well. An incredible amount of good deeds are done there on a daily basis. Binyan Eretz Yisrael, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael increased every day. What else can we ask for? It's a gift. But at the same time, let's not forget our history. Let's, God forbid, not be like those who welcomed the Yemenites in 1949 and said that here you no longer have to keep tradition because you're in Eretz Yisrael. Let's not be like them. Let's remember our traditions. And even as we are celebrating the moment, as our ancestors did in the wilderness, they were celebrating the moment, the inauguration of the Mishkan. It's incredible. Baruch Hashem, we've merited a Mishkan. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has shown us that he accepted our tshuva and our relationship is back on track. Even though they were celebrating that moment in the month of Nisan of year 2, they remembered there's a Pesach. They remembered the fact that there's something that they have to celebrate that occurred 11, 12 months ago. They remembered their roots and did not allow the living in the moment to impact, to affect it in any way. There's a message for us as well, right? That with all our gratitude, let's value tradition. Let's value those who value tradition. Let's realize that there is obviously a way of being appreciative for the now, but not walking away in any form, in any way, in any bit from our tradition. There's a way to do it. So that's number 3 on this Sforno's list, the good deed that could have brought them into the land of Israel. Zrizutam, their enthusiasm to celebrate the Pesach. And number 4, a very important one, throughout the years in the wilderness, and it is something that they had to adapt to very early on in the Midbar. There's no permanence. Everything is up to Hashem, except the fact that sometimes you have to move. It's not easy. It's not easy to pack boxes, but it's the right thing to do if HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to do it. And you cannot live in the land of Israel, where you have land and you feel this deep connection to your soil. And you could say that my grandfather and great-grandfather tilled this land, and I feel connected to them. You cannot do it if you don't have an understanding that everything you get and don't get is from the higher being. And there is nothing that teaches Klal Yisrael better about this idea than the fact that every move in the wilderness was based on guidance from above. That was something they needed to merit an entry into Eretz Yisrael. This is what the Sforno tells us. Things are out of order because there are 4 things that need to be taught. 4 things that need to be taught. That's the idea of what's taking place here. So that's part 1 of our discussion tonight. Part 2, I want to talk to you a little bit about humility, arrogance, or haughtiness. Arrogance. Arrogance is not a good thing in Judaism. We are told that a person has to be an anav, a humble person. A humble person. Now, it's not always easy, but it's always important. You know, one of the great rabbinic figures of our history was Nachmanides, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, or the Ramban. He lived in Spain, was the head of the Jewish community, led a yeshiva, considered a tremendous Torah scholar and a real guide. He had to deal with disputations with the Christians in 1263, and these things were recorded, how he argued and what he said. Eventually, he makes his way to Eretz Yisrael in 1267 and comes to a land where there is desolation. He comes to Yerushalayim, no one's there. He on his own finds a place to daven, and there's a tradition or a legend that the location in Yerushalayim that we call Bet HaKnesset HaRamban was the location that he established as a prayer place. Obviously, we could connect to Nachmanides because we, Baruch Hashem, have access to Yerushalayim today, and people go to the Bet HaKnesset of the Ramban, and outside there's a large plaque with a letter that's known as the letter of the Ramban, the Igeret HaRamban. And the tradition is, this is a very old tradition, that Ramban sent this letter to his son from the land of Israel to guide him spiritually, how to be a good person, how to be a good Jew. And it is such a powerful short letter that some Sidurim have printed it, that people should read it daily. And in it, he talks about different attributes, but one thing he wants us to focus on is on the importance of being humble and not to be an arrogant person. He says that you should know, Hamit Ga'eh, if someone is haughty on others, he is a mored b'malchut shamayim. He is, in essence, a rebel against the Creator. So what should we be doing? You know what we need to be doing to be considered good people? Says the Ramban, whenever you see anyone, in your eyes, view that other person as gadol mimcha, as greater than you. Never, ever look down at anyone, says Ramban. V'chol adam, every single person, ye gadol mimcha be'einecha, should be considered greater than yourself in your own eyes. That's what you should do. How do you do it? We'll find qualities. But the real question is, who could guide us with such an attribute? Or what information can help us to develop what the Ramban expects from us? To look at others and say, you know what, they're greater than me. It's easy for me to do it when I interact with tremendous Torah scholars, with great spiritual individuals. How do I do it with everyone? So we're going to get some guidance from a different Moshe, not from Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, but from Moshe Rabbeinu. At the end of this week's Parsha, we have Miriam speaking about her brother, and we label it Lashon Hara. And the Almighty obviously is not happy with their behavior. It's a righteous woman, remember. It's a woman that had no negative feeling towards her brother. But nevertheless, the Torah was quite strict on her. But the Torah makes it very, very clear that don't think that Moshe Rabbeinu's ego was hurt, because at the end of this week's Parsha, chapter 12, verse 2, Veha'ish Moshe, you need to know, the man Moshe was anav me'od, was exceedingly humble, mikol ha'adam, more than any other person, al pnei ha'adama, on the face of the earth. Now, did Moshe not realize that he is communicating with the Creator and others don't? Did he not realize that the people of Israel cannot manage a couple hours without food, and he managed for 40 days? Did he not realize that he is transmitting to the people of Israel the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that 3,400 years later, we're going to know how to live our life based on his word? How on earth can Moshe Rabbeinu be anav me'od mikol ha'adam asher al pnei ha'adama? How is it possible? What's going on? And don't think this is just good marketing of Moshe. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu testifying. The man simply was humble. He looked at others, did not see himself as better than them. What's the secret, Moshe? How did you do it? So, among the commentators we study often is Rab Meir Simcha of Dvinsk. And he shares with us something in the name of his grandfather, Rav Hanania Cohen Zatzal. And he shares the following insight. Do you know that Moshe Rabbeinu actually lost some elements of his free will? You know that? And why is it so? Because you have to remember, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Klal Yisrael anything they hear from Moshe is the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If people have free will, what if Moshe decides to walk away, God forbid? So obviously, he is a person that his free will is limited. In addition, he notes, Rav Hanania, Moshe Rabbeinu had such clarity about the Creator. The existence of God was not something he had to struggle with and think through and eventually come to a conclusion. It was clear to him, as clear as it is to us that there is a sun. So this is not complete free will. He's a man with complete clarity. On the other hand, everyone else are al pnei ha'adama. We are people that are on earth. We have struggles. In other words, yes, I believe there's a higher being, but I also sometimes have physical traits that pull me down. And I make decisions that are not right. Sometimes I'll get upset, right? Sometimes there are things I do that I shouldn't. I'm a little haughty, perhaps. I have a struggle. Moshe Rabbeinu did not have a struggle. So therefore, says Rav Hanania Cohen, that you should know, the way Moshe Rabbeinu was able to be humble was by understanding he himself has to believe. I'm not so great. I have clarity. I fulfill my responsibility because I see and I understand exactly what I should be doing. But the simple Jew, on the other hand, who's doing good things, despite the fact that he doesn't have that clarity, that is greatness. And that's how Moshe Rabbeinu was able to be humble. And I think that that's a piece of information that we really need to take from Moshe Rabbeinu. Because being humble is basically understanding that the other person might be struggling with what is easy for you, right? If I come to shul, right, and I daven, and I see someone else who's not davening that much, I'm not going to look down at them. Maybe for them it's a struggle. Maybe the little bit of davening they do indicates greatness that is far more valuable than my davening. Maybe the charity they are giving is something that they have a tendency and they have traits. Don't judge the other because you don't know where their battle is. You don't know the person fully. Your greatness sometimes, or the fact that you have more of a clarity, says Moshe Rabbeinu, is more of it's demanding from you, and there's an expectation from you that for others, perhaps there is no such expectation. So be humble. Never, ever judge the other person. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is teaching us. And that's how we have an anav. And, we need to connect as a nation. There's no question. We need to connect with people. And I think you all agree that it is a pleasure to interact, to be associated, to sit next to someone that values you. And the opposite is true if you interact with people that are judgmental, that are looking you up and down and assessing you and figuring out if you're good or you're not good. There's no room for that. If you want to assess, you have yourself, and perhaps you even have some control over yourself, and you could become a better person. The other person, don't judge them. You have no idea what they're going through. You have no idea of what struggles they have. You don't know their history. You don't know their personality. You don't know anything about them. And therefore, never judge. And be inspired by a Moshe Rabbeinu who can go ahead and panim el panim, have a conversation with the Creator as no one else has ever had. No one has had an impact on humanity like Moshe Rabbeinu. And he is Anav me'od mikol ha'adam asher al pnei adama. Everyone else, he looks at them and says, you know what? For where they are holding, this is impressive. This is what we are told to do. And it's a Parashat Beha'alotcha is a loaded parsha where we begin slipping. Next week is the tragic event of the Meraglim. And then we have the Korach failure. And if we are taught about failures, it is for us to be inspired and realizing how damaging they could be and what we could do to go ahead and avoid them. And if Jewish unity is the answer, to get us back on track, there's no question that there's something extremely important that needs to be learned from our great teacher Moshe, who was an Anav Me'od, Mikol Adam Asher al Pnei Adama. Tonight's shir was in memory of Tzvi Khan. Yortzeit is tonight. A person that I had the privilege of having a connection to, getting to know, conversing with him was always easy and a pleasure. And the way I interacted with people was a pleasure. So indeed, as we study here tonight about the importance of humility and other good traits, we remember Tzvi. So thank you again, Susan, for sponsoring. We have him in mind. Neshama should have an aliyah. We should merit only good news and happiness. And thank you everyone for joining. Should be a wonderful evening, and a Shabbat Shalom to all.